I wanted to give just a little bit of framing for the conversation before we dive in. The headline for today, the topic is what every American should know. And that is indeed one of the projects of our program at our Aspen Institute program. And the origin of that project is, on the one hand, obvious. We're in a time right now where questions of history and belonging and identity are so hotly contested, where we are not only arguing about what to teach, but arguing about whether to teach our past in certain ways. And that reality sets a context for this question, as does the obvious reality of demographic change in the United States and the ways in which the long heralded future of a country in which the majority of people are people of color has already arrived, literally and figuratively, in babies born in the last couple of years. And so these shifts are material, but they're having huge, deep psychic impacts on our story of us. So that's the general context. But for us as a program in this project, a few years ago, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic that was looking back upon a 1987 book that the scholar E.D. Hirsch had written called Cultural Literacy. And this book was a somewhat academic tome about the ways that readers form background knowledge. That if you're going to read anything, whether it's the newspaper, the sports pages, a novel, you have to have certain kinds of common knowledge, background knowledge, to understand all the different implicit references that are being made. And that book was, in its own right, important. But what made it a surprise cultural phenomenon in the late 80s was that he had appended a list of 5,000 things every American should know. And this was before listicles and the internet, but people went crazy over this list and arguing about this list and what should and shouldn't be included, and whether it was too deferential to a dead white male notion of Americanness, whether it was to this, to that, and that in many ways was the beginning, or in the early phases, of what we would now think of as Culture War Part 1. I don't know what part we're in now, but that was the 80s version. What I said in this essay was that, looking back a generation later, Hirsch was half right. He was right that a country as far-flung, diverse, and inherently centrifugal as ours, and it's only more so now, does need common knowledge. We do need some common basis of understanding of what we're referring to, because we come from different creeds, traditions, faiths, backgrounds, places of origin, and so forth. But where his conception a generation earlier had been deficient was that we have an opportunity now to make that notion, that base of common knowledge, far, far more inclusive and diverse, not only in looking back at our past and refusing to, again, literally or figuratively, whitewash the past, but also in our present, and whose voices and stories and histories and ideas should, even in the first place, have standing to be heard in the conversation about what every American should know. And so we created this simple project with a website, whateveramericanshouldknow.org. And instead of inviting people to come up with lists of 5,000, because only a handful of civic literary nerds like those gathered here today in our conversation would actually come up with 5,000 things, but just to invite folks, come up with 10. What are 10 things you think every American should know? And then we invited people to submit these, and there is this ever-evolving crowdsourced list that has emerged. And we've, of course, over time, invited different luminaries to submit their own, and you'll see on the website people like Anne Marie Slaughter, Henry Louis Gates Jr., David Henry Hwang, and others have submitted their top 10 lists. But this conversation today is part of that ongoing project to help give all of us some tools to ask each other, what should we all know? And who is the us that's talking when we talk about what we should all know?